Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I want to welcome you to the latest in our Center for Transportation webinars. Today, we are going to present a rapid response webinar on transportation at the ballot box. We're going to take a look at how transportation fared in this week's midterm vote, both in terms of elected officials and individuals, how it affects Congress, and how that's all going to play out in terms of transportation with the related committees and elsewhere. And also how transportation measures fared at the ballot box. Has been tracking this for a number of years, and we'll dig into some of the preliminary information about that. So joining me is Jeff Davis. Jeff is Senior Fellow and Editor at Transportation Weekly, probably well known to a lot of people here, and Jonathan Hammond, who is an associate here who has been digging through all of the hundreds of ballot measures with me. We have about 30 minutes for the webinar today. We have an awful lot to cover. The plan is for Jeff to start off on the political side, and then we will discuss what we know about the measures that voters saw this year. We're going to try to take time to answer questions if we have time. So use the question function on the webinar website. You don't have to wait till the end to ask questions. I really want to thank you all again for joining us today. And with that, take it away, Jeff Davis.
Okay. Thank you very much, Rob. Slide next. First, we're going to start with the Senate, where it looks like we're going to have a narrow Democratic majority this time, but a real majority, not a tie. One seat flip, Pennsylvania. So there's Democrats start off up +1. There's the Georgia's going to a runoff in December 6th, no matter what. They're still counting in Nevada. Adam Laxalt is up 19,000 votes right now, but with the 140 or so that are outstanding, whether from Clark and Washoe counties, and with the percentage that Cortez Masto has been getting from those counties so far, I expect she'll win with about 15,000 votes at the end. Arizona, they're still counting, but like Kelly's up, 95,000 votes, which is a good place to be. So most likely situation is that we go into the Georgia runoff, 51-49 Democratic majority, and then Georgia determines whether it stays at 51 or goes back to 50, in which case we'd still be at the barest of Democratic majorities. So, or could be 52, depending on what else happens. So, slide please. If they can actually get to a 51-seat majority, it's quicker to move bills and nominations, but it's not that much quicker. And you have slightly more Democratic committee seats than Republican seats. One per committee. The important thing with that, if you can get an actual Democratic majority, then the combination of Manchin and Sinema becomes a little bit less important. And assuming the House goes Republican, which I think it will barely, there's less pressure to kill filibuster, since no matter whether you have a filibuster or not, you're going to have a Republican House that's going to stop partisan legislation. So, but the problem is that now that we're almost done with 2022, people are looking ahead to 2024. And that is just the nightmare of all nightmare maps for Democrats coming up in 2 years. Slide, please. The class ones are just terrible for them. Democrats have to defend West Virginia, red, redder than red. Ohio, red. Michigan, Wisconsin could go red. Montana, very red. Nevada, Arizona, purple. New Mexico gets weird occasionally. Virginia and Minnesota also purple. All the Republicans are defending are Florida, Texas, Mississippi, Tennessee, Missouri, Indiana, North Dakota, Wyoming, Utah, and both seats in Nebraska. So it's very easy to see Republicans batting 1,000 there, and Democrats, could lose 3 or 4 of those seats, even in a fairly good Democratic year. So McConnell, Mr. Long Game, is going to sit back and say, well, I can get it back in 2 years at any rate. Slide, please. The musical chairs going on in the Senate was pretty much the same. A lot of this was guaranteed no matter who took control of the chamber. There's no change at EPW for the highway policy. At Banking Committee for mass transit policy, there's no change at chairman. It's going to stay Sherry Brown. There's going to be a change in ranking member because Mr. Toomey retired. So Tim Scott from South Carolina has the seniority to replace Toomey. Scott has shown no interest in mass transit so far, but neither has any other Republican on banking. And Toomey did only because he had to as his ranking member. They've had 2 transit hearings in the last Congress, I think. No Republican showed up at either one, asked a single question, except for Toomey being there as ex officio as ranking member. There's a $300 million CIG grant in the works in South Carolina for low country BRT. So maybe when that starts to come close to getting signed for its grant agreement, Mr. Scott will pay more attention. Who knows? All the rest of transportation policy, aviation, rail, and safety is the Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee. Ms. Cantwell is going to stay the same at chairman, but Roger Wicker is going to move over to the Armed Services Committee because of Jim Inhofe retiring. And so he'll be replaced by Ted Cruz. And that is a big deal philosophically and vote-wise, because the Armed Services, the Commerce Committee has tended to craft its transportation legislation via bipartisan consensus behind the scenes, where that they put together a joint work product. Mr. Cruz has in the past voted against that work product. Slide, please. You can see that there were 3 Republicans that voted against the otherwise bipartisan, unanimous rail and highway safety and multimodal freight reauthorization title that was then picked up and put without change in the IIJA. Cruz, Mike Lee, and Rick Scott. So you can see that going from a person who has supported bipartisan consensus with Maria Cantwell and Wicker to Ted Cruz is a bit of a sea change there, philosophically, temperamentally, maybe. But you also got to remember that he's only one man with one vote. And so even on issues where that he's going to have significant differences from Wicker. For example, Wicker's from a big shipyard state. It's all about Jones Act. Cruz is very critical of Jones Act. You've never seen anyone love Amtrak more than Roger Wicker wanting to restore that Gulf Coast service. Cruz not so much in love with Amtrak. But if all the rest of the committees or the majority of the Republicans on the committee are still believing in the things they believed in last year and are supportive of Amtrak and rail to almost ridiculous degree, and supportive of Jones Act, supportive of Buy America, you get the issue of how much does Cruz really matter if there's a majority of Republicans on this panel who are prepared to vote with Cantwell and the Democrats on a lot of these issues. Because Cruz will be ranking member, he will control the machinery and the staff, etc., of the committee, and can, do a lot of things and raise a lot of attention for issues. But when it comes down to it, he can't necessarily convince a lot of his Republican colleagues to abandon positions they have held in the past that are of deep concern to their states. For example, Mr. Moran has gotten all been out of shape for years over, trying to force Amtrak to keep the Southwest Chief going, and I don't see why Ted Cruz replacing Roger Wicker is going to change the way Jerry Moran feels about the Southwest Chief or what he's willing to do on the floor to make sure the Chief keeps going. Now, the big issue that's going to come up for transportation in the next Congress is going to be aviation. The 2018 Aviation Reduction Act, Reauthorization Act, expires next year. So that'll be the main focus of the committee. Cruz was the head Republican on that subcommittee. He'll be moving up to the full committee, have to give it up. And Jerry Moran from Kansas, which has more general aviation manufacturing than any other state, is very eager and likely to take the head slot on that aviation subcommittee. Slide, please. On appropriations, you've got some more musical chairs. Patrick Leahy and Richard Shelby are both retiring as the chairman and ranking member of the full appropriations committee. They'll be replaced by Patty Murray and Susan Collins. And Susan Collins has been for 12 years now the head Republican on the Transportation and Housing Subcommittee. So she's term limited both ways, even if she weren't moving up to be a ranking member on the full committee. And so even though Brian Schatz is almost certain to stay put as the chairman of the subcommittee, we've got there'll be an opening if they can bid for it on seniority for the ranking member of the Transportation Subcommittee. Assuming Mr. McConnell remains minority leader, he won't be eligible. So then you've got Lisa Murkowski is next in subcommittee seniority. And normally, this is a great subcommittee, except that Murkowski is currently on the Interior Department subcommittee, And Alaska being Alaska and the degree which the federal government owns the land there, that's actually maybe more important to them than transportation. Otherwise, Lindsey Graham has subcommittee that has a seniority could want it. And if Graham passes it up, then like I said, Jerry Moran would almost certainly take Thud. So we'll see about that. So that's the way to, but the important thing to remember is that the appropriation bills are still going to require 60 votes in the Senate. So even though the Democrats will probably have a real actual functioning majority, they can't move bills through the chamber unless Collins and her crew sign off. So Republicans on the Appropriations Committee are much more important in most years, or minority members of the Appropriations Committee are much more important than minority members of other committees, just because those bills have to pass. And in order to get to 60, they generally require minority buy-in in committee and on the floor. Slide, please. Then over in the House, the narrowest of narrow Republican majorities is likely. So when I was looking at this, setting up an analysis of all the seats, I'd said, okay, first focus on the low-hanging fruit. Slide. The seats that the forecasters like Charlie Cook and Larry Sabato were predicting were going to flip parties, either because of redistricting or some other mismatch, retirement, etc. So they're likely and leaners. There were 12 of those, and every one of those so far that has been called, they've been called the way that Cook and Sabato predicted they would be. There's 2 that are still counting. So out of all that, the GOP has netted 6 so far, and that could go as high as 8, depending on Arizona 6 and Oregon 5 when they get done counting. So the Dems started at 222 and the R's at 213. And so now, if everything else stays the same, the Republicans have a 1 to 3 seat majority, the barest of majorities, because 218 is the magic number. But there's still 423 other seats in the House. And a lot of those are, some of those are closer than others. Slide, please. Everywhere else, Republicans have flipped 4 seats in New York State because the Dems overreached on the map they tried to do and then got struck down, and a court wound up appointing a special master to write the districts, and Virginia 2. But Democrats have flipped North Carolina 13, New Mexico 2, Ohio 1, and Texas 34. So it's down to a net of +1 for the R's there. There's still 20 or so being counted in those slow vote by mail states in California, Nevada, Washington, Oregon, Arizona, most of which have the incumbent party in the lead. Alaska and Jared Golden in Maine are going to go to ranked choice voting, and we'll find out in 2 weeks. Connecticut 5 and Colorado 3 are still too close to call, with almost all votes in. I think it's like 63 votes in Colorado 3 right now, with more being counted. But the most likely scenario of all this is that the R's wind up with a majority of between 4 and 5 seats, at 221 or 222, since 218 is the bare mathematical majority. And that's a ridiculously small, very difficult majority to run. Slide, please. Now, the Republicans have promised ever since COVID to get rid of proxy voting, which was banned in the House for 200 some years and brought in because of COVID. But good luck running the day-to-day and getting 218 warm bodies that will support you into the room every time you need one without proxy voting. I'm thinking they may have to suck it up and not fulfill that promise. Committees are going to conduct constant investigations because you can have investigations without being able to win votes on the floor. The only vote that matters is the vote for speaker, then the vote to appoint committees, in January, and after that they get to run for 2 years on their own. Winning votes on the floor for partisan legislation is going to require long lead time, painstaking outreach to members while bills are being drafted, and then strong enforcement against people who don't toe the line. And I don't see anyone on the Republican side who has the leadership skills that Nancy Pelosi demonstrated over the last few Congresses in keeping all the cats herded. But I could be surprised. Wait and see. It's going to be a very difficult 2 years. Slide. On T&I committee on the Republican side, Sam Graves will be chairman. You had 3 high-ranking retirements or defeats, and Michelle Steele, they're still counting her race. But for the most part, the R's on Republican on T&I are going to stay put. They'll probably get another couple of seats added to their to be able to allow freshmen and sophomores to join the committee. Some of these R's on T&I will get promoted to Appropriations or Ways and Means or Energy and Commerce and Financial Services and create a little more space for freshmen. Slide. There's a lot more chaos on the Democratic side. Peter DeFazio left. So it'll be up to between Eleanor Holmes Norton and Rick Larson in a race probably early December to vote for the ranking minority slot. You had several others. Dina Titus, something like 1,700 votes, I think, right now. So will probably pull through, but you never know. And so they're going to probably get shrunk down to around 31 seats. And some of the Democrats who left 2 years ago to go to Appropriations or Ways and Means may get booted off those committees and try to come back and reclaim seniority on T&I. Slide, please. I forgot to change the header. This is my standard slide. Aviation against topic number one, and it's the only major transportation mode where reauthorization has to happen in this Congress. Now, the thing to remember is that although Republicans have loved complaining about elements of the IIJA, all the money that was provided by the IIJA, all the contract authority, and all the advanced appropriations in Division J is guaranteed by law. The Impoundment Control Act requires the administration to release that money for obligation on schedule. Any change in that would require Congress passing and Biden signing a new law. So it's not going to happen. Now, for things that would require congressional action, that's a different story. Like I said, the authorization for aviation will be going through. And mass transit may come back and ask for more operating aid in the next 2 years when their COVID aid runs out. Now, the T&I Republicans would have to sign off on that and maybe get something in return for that. But in terms of fulfilling the IIJA, they can raise questions about the implementation. They can hold hearings. They can require DOT people to show up and get yelled at, in a public forum. But their ability to affect the way the IIJ money is being spent is not great. Next slide, please. On appropriations, we're flipping going back and forth between Kay Granger and Rosa DeLauro, chairman and ranking member. David Price was the chairman. He retired. Republicans will take that over. But Mario Diaz-Balart is term limited off of Transportation HUD and won't be getting a waiver probably. I don't think they're going to be giving out waivers. So, but there'll be a choice of well-seasoned, reasonably non-extremist Republicans who would probably take that subcommittee. Maybe Hal Rogers, the dean, maybe Mike Simpson, maybe Tom Cole, one of those guys. And on the Democratic side, it'll be Mike Quigley from Chicago, a lot of railroad attention, to be the ranking minority member. Slide. Now, I found this fascinating, is that in Westminster style democracies like in England, if an appropriations bill ever fails to pass on final passage, that is the same thing functionally as a vote of no confidence. The prime minister has to resign, the government falls, new elections get called. We don't have that in America, but maybe we should, because I cannot imagine drafting a spending bill for an appropriations bill in many of these departments that can attract 218 out of 221 or 222 of members of this Republican conference. Very difficult to do so. So again, all this winds up doing is empowering the Senate Appropriations Committee on a bipartisan basis. And on tax bills, don't even bother trying in divided government. I don't see any way forward for that. Even if you could, the fact that the Republican majority is single-handedly dependent on New York State members means that the people are going to be wanting that SALT fix again if we ever get another tax bill. So we'll see how that goes. Slide, please. And that's all I have, and I'm turning over to Rob on ballot measures.
Thanks a lot, Jeff. Really, really amazing stuff and tremendous insights. I could listen to Jeff talk about this stuff all day. I know many of you probably are in the same boat. I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan Hammond here in just a second, but I want to give just a little bit of background on the ballot measures work that we've been doing for the last few years. Next slide, please, John. We have been tracking all of this since about 2016. We do believe that cities, states, localities, transit agencies, special districts are increasingly going to voters to approve all kinds of things for transportation, spending, borrowing, and a lot more policy questions we've seen over the last few years, asking voters very specifically about things that aren't related to spending or tax increases. It's hard to say whether this is increasing. Obviously, when there's a major election, 2016, for example, was a high watermark. We had 500 or so measures, some really, really big ones. It tends to dip during the off years. We had about 315 in 2018, several hundred more in 2019. COVID changed a lot of the plans for a lot of places, so we didn't see that many of the last few years. But clearly, they've picked back up again, and I'm going to talk through some of those here in just a second. Many of these are kind of mundane and routine, Some are really ambitious and potentially transformative for regions, states, and cities. Next slide, please. The reason we started this is because there really isn't any comprehensive centralized database for all transportation measures. A lot of organizations will focus on single modes or on specialized projects, but we really thought it was important to get a comprehensive look. There's a website called Ballot PD you probably know about that collects some of these, but it's really hard to sort just out the transportation ones. So we wanted to make the database as comprehensive as possible. We collect data from a wide range of sources, county officials, state officials, private media reporting, to really get as much in there as we can. We don't include school measures. There's a lot of transportation-related things within these school bonds that are all across the country. We don't include those. We don't include candidates for transportation-related offices like railroad commissioner. It was really amazing seeing those all over the country. But again, we try to be as comprehensive as we can with all the data and the information. But we don't make any assessment on the quality of the investments or the decisions. We are an independent nonprofit. We certainly have strong opinions individually about whether these are good or not. But as far as this research in the database goes, we're just collecting the facts about what was before voters and what happened. Next slide, please, John. So just quickly about Ohio and Michigan, we have all of these measures in here, but it's a special case in both states. They routinely require certain tax provisions to go before voters. So small municipalities in both of those states that need to maintain a property tax, to maintain sidewalks and streets, that goes before voters. They pass pretty frequently, and they're obviously transportation related, but they're routine, and we don't include them because it tends to skew the results. About 56% of all the measures this year were these small, they call millages in those two states. It's about $30 million in annual spending, so it's not insignificant, but some of these were much, much larger. And so we actually keep those separate. And as we go through this analysis, those aren't reflected in here. The other state to talk about just quickly is California. There used to be lots and lots of measures in California, but we saw this year that what would have been local transportation measures were combined with lots of other what they call government services type measures. So they would include affordable housing, homelessness, police, fire, wildfire protection, things like that. And transportation was rolled up in there. That clearly seems to be some kind of strategy that officials are using there in that state. But we excluded those this year and any other measure where we couldn't pull out the transportation elements with as much precision as we wanted to. Next slide, please, John. So what that did, that means that this year we actually saw most measures in the South. This is a flip. We used to see most of them in the West and the Intermountain West that have a long history of going to voters to approve all kinds of different things. But for lots of different reasons, the South turned out to be by far the most popular as far as these transportation measures went. The Midwest, when you take out Ohio and Michigan, kind of dipped down a little bit. And historically, there's never been that many in the Northeast, but actually we saw a couple of really interesting ones this year that John is going to talk about here with the next slide. Over to you, John.
Great. Thank you so much, Rob. So as usual, revenue mostly proposed came from bonds, sales, and property taxes. Bonds were one of the largest shares, and that's again because many initiatives that we were talking about happened in Texas, which issues a lot of bonds in that department, but also sales taxes, which in some ways did very well, but in other major cases, which I'll talk about in a little bit, didn't pass as highly. Property taxes such as millages were also used extensively throughout this. And we also saw some policy amendments which changed, for instance, how certain agencies functioned or who was a part of them or what sort of money they dealt out, and well as a couple of fuel taxes, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But we estimate that around $8.4 billion was at stake in 2023, and about $186 billion was at stake over the next 20 years. We'll have more information on that as we continue compiling results. So with that in mind, most of measures supported roads alone. A large share, 30% or more, supported more than one mode, which is an increase that we've seen since 2016, since we started seriously recording these efforts, which was interesting to see. But they usually were multimodal in the sense that they supported roads plus pedestrian as well as bike infrastructure. And of the 26 transit measures, more than half, so 61%, were multimodal, talking about that trend that Rob was referencing earlier. And then we also had a few measures for aviation, waterborne, and as well as other vehicles that are not always multimodal. But we'll talk about more of those measures in the next slide. So a few select measures that we want to talk about today include California's Proposition 30, which was going to be a tax on income above $2 million for zero-emission vehicles. It failed 60-40. But a fair share amendment that fared a little better, which was a tax on income over $1 million in Massachusetts for transit, bridges, and education, managed to pass. Interestingly enough, the relatively transit-less Western Massachusetts and Berkshire County ended up voting more for the measure than both Springfield and Worcester, which tend to have larger and denser populations. In addition, Oakland, Macomb, and Wayne counties in Michigan, just outside of Detroit, also voted to renew their property taxes or their millages in support for transit. In this case, the regional transit agency SMART. And separate measures in Hillsborough and Orange County in Florida actually came out in different ways. Orange County's half-cent sales tax, which was going to raise billions over the next 20 years, ended up failing. But Hillsborough County's sales tax passed for both roads and transit in the area. A property tax in Denver also did very well. Eventually, it seems to have passed, and it includes ambitious plans for sidewalk renewal and construction programs. And it will be interesting to see how that evolves over the next couple of days. And then also in Georgia, there were 10 T-splost, or that's another way of saying sales tax. Out of the 10 sales taxes that would have gone to support transportation, over 70% of them passed. And that happened in mostly rural Georgia. Just some other measures that I think would be worth mentioning is that Philadelphia managed to create an aviation department because the city actually manages 2 airports. So it is now going to be its own department within the city of Philadelphia. It's being shifted out of its commerce department with a head appointed directly by the Philadelphia city government. And in addition to that, a fuel tax in Carson City, Nevada seems to have passed as well, which was one of 2 fuel taxes on the ballots in this year. So I think the early takeaways that we found so far is that it's a challenge. The challenge that we're trying to tackle right now is to understand the quality of these investments and these decisions. And there seems to be a trend for more multimodal measures since 2016, either compiling them with other transportation-related activities, or also just pairing them with other areas of local governance. But there seems to be little controversy for most local road and street measures. The very few user fee options that we've seen remain unpopular. I just mentioned that one in Carson City, and that's mostly because it was an exception, not necessarily something that proves any sort of rule. But if there's anything that we've learned over this year's tracking of these measures, is that there clearly needs to be a need to continue to track and assess these measures, not only so that state legislatures and activists can get an understanding of what's going on and what happens in their backyards, but also so that we can get a better sense of where transportation policy is going as a whole.
Great. Thanks very much, John, and thanks, Jeff, and thank you everybody for joining. This is clearly, as we said, a rapid response webinar. We got to pull this together here these last couple of days to be able to figure out what happened this week. A couple of folks, I think, in the chat have talked about the Hillsborough County measure. I do think that also did fail, but we'll go back and check on all that, just make sure we have all the data and the information right on our end. We are going to write all this up, and we're going to make this database available for folks to take a look at. We're still plowing through the findings. Jonathan's been spending a lot of time looking at these election results, and it's actually very interesting at the conflicting results we're getting from different sources. But we'll continue to do that, make it available. And if you are not subscribing to Transportation Weekly, obviously hearing from Jeff and hearing about the tremendous insights that he and the team provide every single week, you really should be subscribing to Transportation Weekly, which you can do on our website at www.enotrans.org. So again, really want to thank you all for joining us here today. We're going to continue to stay on top of this. We really appreciate the questions. Jeff and John, thank you so much. Have a great day, everybody.